Because I feel like that really tells the story of where we are in the world and this chip war. Do you think the relevant question in this month, April of 2025, is can the Chinese chip companies survive without relying on the U.S. and the ecosystem that we're already familiar with?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Relative to that question, I think there's no doubt that the Chinese domestic semiconductor industry can and has already proven that it will survive without potentially access to some of what we in the West would have considered critical technology. When you think about companies like Huawei, who was just mentioned, or DeepSeek, or YMTC, which is one of the most advanced fabs in China, you can actually see that they have successfully been able to keep on the technology curve without access to certain technologies that we thought would have potentially slowed down that growth of that industry. So I'd say yes, there's no question that the Chinese are at parity or very close to being at parity.
And the idea for the CHIPS Act is really bringing all these semi-related capacity to the United States. Would it make sense for these global chip makers to bring production to the United States without the incentives provided in the CHIPS Act?
Well, without the incentives and with still having access to the Chinese market, which isn't the case,
right,
then the answer would be no. Probably not. You would not see that inward investment into the United States. The CHIPS Act is meant to attract further domestic investment, but it's also meant to bring onshore companies like TSMC and others to build the most leading edge fabs into the United States. It's also meant to foster the industry, the food chain that supports these companies, like the capital equipment companies, like the critical materials providers, to have them onshore into the United States as well. Without those incentives, and they're quite long-range incentives that have to be in place, I'm not sure that we would see the U.S. necessarily come back and be fully competitive as a chips manufacturer. I mean, the U.S. makes roughly 20% plus or minus of the worldwide chips right now. That's down from, say, almost 40% less than 15 years ago. So to attract that and to pull it back, we need to have incentives, but we also need to be able to be cost effective and be able to do this at scale.
Yeah.
That's the issue that the CHIPS Act is trying to solve.
Exactly, and finding the right talent out in the U.S. and price related to labor seems to be really the big problem that many are talking about there. Then do you think these tariffs being pushed for by the Trump administration would be yet another reason for not only for China but for many others around the world to think about self-sufficiency? Okay, sure, we might have been thinking about putting down some money to build out food chain, as you describe it, in the United States. But given what's going on with the United States, maybe we want to bring it onshore to our own country or closer to my region.
I don't think there's no doubt that that's what's happening. The tariff situation, the initial restrictions that were placed on China, as you mentioned earlier, they have all served to create a more nationalistic approach to technology. You can see programs, of course, in the U.S., we've already mentioned the CHIPS Act and others, but also you can see the same effect is occurring in Europe, and we've already seen Chinese emergence as well. So the tariffs and the restrictions, it just leads to a fragmentation of the industry. It's going to become less efficient. It's going to cost the industry quite a bit of money, but also significant delays in the growth of the industry as well. It's an impediment, definitely.
Yeah, Kevin Martin here. Pleasure having you on the show. So listen, the way I think about it is, I mean, the CHIPS Act, which President Trump seems intent on killing, and you're probably not feeling great about that, having advised on it, right? That was sort of, a carrot, incentives, as you described it. The tariffs seem to be a stick, which the president is using to say, look, you could onshore and build capacity to make chips in the U.S., or you could stay offshore and attract tariffs. I'm not sure that's sort of the right way to go about it. But I want to get past that and get you to talk to us about what are called the diffusion rules, which started under President Biden and is under review by the Trump administration right now. He needs to make a decision by the middle of next month, and this is regarding ways and means to restrict access and exports of critical chip as well as AI technology, certainly to adversaries, including China, right? How is President Trump likely to rule on this, do you think? And very specifically, do you think the big hole that these rules need to address is higher up the food chain where chip making equipment is concerned? Because, I mean, China can make the chips. They don't quite have the chip making gear yet. But if we restrict access to that, that could slow them down. What do you think?
Well, first of all, there's nothing, I can't say anything to predict what Mr. Trump is going to do from one day to the next. It's everybody's coin toss at this point. The reality is that right now at the design side and at the device side, I think there's very close to parity that exists between China and the U.S., et cetera. What doesn't exist necessarily, as you just mentioned, is the capital equipment, which still is pretty much resonant in the United States and or in the Netherlands with ASML. And then you can look at the critical subsystems, the parts that go into these pieces of capital equipment. That's primarily in Europe. So there is already some diffusion that's already occurring or has occurred over the last several decades. I don't see a situation where Mr. Trump carries through. Well, it seems illogical to me that he would carry through with these continued restrictions and tariffs, and you can already see that he's starting to back off from those policies literally almost every day. It's just not sustainable.
All right, Kevin, let's get to ADISYN then and graphene. And you bought the IP by buying that Israeli chip IP company. Why graphene? There are a couple of other competing technologies for sort of next-gen chips. But why graphene when some folks are talking about, I'm sure you're familiar with a company called Lightspeed, which is literally using light.
Sure. So first of all, let's remember what we're trying to accomplish here. We have this insatiable desire for smaller, faster, cheaper chips. And that is what's being driven by the use of AI, by of course, banking, online banking. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Even when you think about cars having to make real-time decisions about crash avoidance, when you think about autonomous drive vehicles. Those require very, very quick decision-making capabilities. In the industry, in the semiconductor industry, those chips that are used to make those decisions, the smallest design rule that we're talking about here is approximately 1/50th of the diameter of your hair. So we're literally talking about being able to carry current at the atomic or tens of atoms wide thicknesses. Copper, which is the current conductive material that's used in these designs, is not capable of carrying these currents at these small scales. The resistance goes up, we start getting latency, and therefore the devices don't do what we want them to do as consumers or as users from a business perspective. There are a number of tricks to get down that curve. You mentioned the use of opto, the use of photonic type of solutions. Yes, that's real. However, that's still probably 10 years or so away to becoming really mature and useful in the industry. There are other methods that are very expensive. But then you get to graphene.
Kevin, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. Kevin Crofton of ADISYN. Squawk is coming right back.